Getting into how to set proper CPA targets. So obviously there's lots of reasons as to why you want to have CPA targets. Generally it pertains to understanding profitability. Step one in doing this is understanding what your gross margins are, or effectively what your margins are after your variable costs. So it's not always as simple as just saying I spent X amount of dollars to buy certain per unit and then I sell for Y. There are some other considerations that have to be taken into account. So of course there are the cost of goods sold, but some other things are things like processing fees, so your credit card processing fees. Taking that into account when factoring in your variable costs / gross margins. Then you have shipping. So if you are personally covering some of the shipping costs, obviously this has to be taken into account as well. And then of course there are also returns as well as storage. So depending on what your inventory turnover speed is, sometimes you could also incur storage costs depending on how you are managing your inventory. So these are all things that have to be taken into account when setting CPAs to understand fundamentally. Maybe all those things factor in to be $25 and I'm on average selling things for $100, therefore I have $75 to work with of margin from a gross margin standpoint. The second consideration when thinking about setting CPA targets is of course LTV. So for some businesses, LTV is not a huge amount of the equation, i.e. they essentially may have a very high percentage of revenue that comes from first customers only, or first time customers only, I should say. This might be because they are a one product store, or perhaps they just do not have a catalog of products that necessarily warrant a lot of repeat purchasing. So there are some situations when this doesn't have to be taken into account that much, but more often than not, the bulk of profit realized for a lot of e-commerce stores comes from the repeat customers. So for the sake of example, maybe I have $25 of variable cost when I sell products, and on average I sell products, or my average order value I should say, is $100, and then maybe I acquire customers for $75. In this situation I break even, and if you only consider the first side of this, which is understanding gross margins / variable costs, you may say, oh, well, this math doesn't work. I'm breaking even. Functionally, I need to yield a profit. Well, that is why you want to look at your 30, your 60, your 90-day LTV, or perhaps even different timeframes depending on your cash considerations, because those sales are generally not only going to drive more profit for you as they convert, but they're also going to be your most profitable sales, assuming that you're no longer using paid acquisition to convert and using more of a fixed cost sales channel. So when taking into account what your CPAs need to be in order to make the business model or the offer work, this is certainly a super important variable that is often overlooked. Lastly, getting into profit requirements. So of course, after you've understood what your gross margins are as well as your LTV, every single business should be having a minimum net margin target. And the reason why is because, for an extreme example, let's say you're growing 100% month over month. Obviously, not many businesses ever do that, perhaps when you are very small, but for the sake of example, let's say that is the case. And then let's say you have 5% net margins. Depending on your supplier terms, as well as perhaps financing, more often than not, if you are simply scaling from a free cash flow standpoint, you're not going to be able to keep up with that type of top line growth with that amount of net margin. So understanding this, and sorry to clarify, the reason is you wouldn't be able to keep up with the inventory investment. So having those profit requirements is super important, because although you may be saying, oh, I'm happy to be 5-10% profitable, I'm super focused on growth. Well, no, you might have to actually maintain a certain CPA to ensure you're keeping up a certain amount of profitability to continue growing. To wrap things up, just to summarize, the three main things to consider when setting your CPA targets: gross margin / variable cost, understanding after all the costs of making the product, storing the product, shipping the product, processing payments, etc., effectively your variable costs, what do you have left over? Secondly, LTV, understanding at what speed do you get certain LTV increases on a per customer basis? And then lastly, what are your profit requirements, depending on how fast you're trying to scale, in order to keep up with the growth of the business?